Welcome back to Mental Health Matters. We got another incredible show for everyone today, and we are so glad you are with us today. And today we've got a bunch of people in the house, but you are listening to KRUU 100.1 on your FM dial. And this show is Mental Health Matters with Dr. Scott Terry. You could listen to these shows, by the way. You could go to the Mental Health Matters website, so you can go to Ardent Center website, www.ardent, A-R-D-E-N-T, CENTER.com, and you could go to that website, or you could go to YouTube channel and you could type in Ardent Counseling Center. And you could see a bunch of the shows there, which one of our wonderful guests, Bella, has been doing some of the translation so that they are closed captioning. So we've got Bella, Elizabeth, and Kyle today. So why don't you guys introduce yourselves? Bella, say hi.
Hi.
And Bella, you're an intern doing some work, some great work on a bunch of these kind of supportive tasks of ours, right?
Yes.
Okay. And Kyle and Elizabeth, why don't you tell us about yourselves for 2 seconds and say what you're doing the show on today, what we're doing the show.
Okay, my name's Elizabeth. I am currently studying to be a music teacher, and I'm also a musician myself, and here's Kyle.
Hi, I'm Kyle, and we're on the phone right now, and I'm an intern of Dr. Scott Terry. I'm going to be going to graduate school for clinical mental health counseling. I'm starting this fall, and we're going to be doing the show on life satisfaction and money. Does money bring you increased life satisfaction for you or for people in general, and does it bring happiness?
Excellent. And so this is a really interesting topic, one that I really want to talk about because, you know, we're going to do another show on couples work and money, but people often feel like, you know, like in couples work, right? People, the thing that we always fight about in couples relationships is about money, chores, sex, right? Being on the same page, communication. But money is always one of the big ones. And for us personally, this is always one of our big issues in life. Like, if I only had more money, then I would be happier. And it's this notion we have that being success means having money. And again, that's not necessarily true either. And so we come up with this stuff from society or from whatever world that comes up with these notions in our mind of what is success, what is happiness, how does finances and this resource, this energy, however you describe money, and what does it mean, and how does it bring us happiness or not bring us happiness, and how do we live our lives, and how do we raise our kids with money or without money to have them have a sense of well-being and balance. So, Kyle, why don't you introduce the topic a little bit more and start digging in?
So, there's a more world view where you can say there's different parts of the world where people have different standards of living. And here in the U.S., with the typical even low income to high income, we can't imagine what it would be like having less. And research shows that having a loss of money, going down standard, can really impact you, can really have an impact and increase depression, and you feel such a sense of loss. But having an increase in money doesn't impact you nearly as much. Now, we have to eat, we have to go on vacation, and that's not to deny the research that also says if you're making over, I've heard different numbers, $60,000, $70,000, $75,000. If you're making over this number, then your day-to-day satisfaction, life satisfaction, increases. You have more money for traveling, you have more money to eat, you don't have to worry so much about just making the bill and feeding your children. But after that line, the 60,000, 70,000, 75,000 line, it doesn't really seem to increase day-to-day satisfaction. Of course, the ultra wealthy, that can increase your more overall satisfaction. So David Kahneman talks about the experiencing self versus the remembering self.
Ooh, say more about that.
So there's actually a great TED Talk on this, where
that's TED, TED, and I recommend every single person who's never listened to a TED Talk to go to TED.com. That's www.t as in Tom, E as in Edward, D as in dog.com. Some of the best shows out there, some of the best free resources on the entire planet are right there. Also at NPR, there's something called TED Radio Hour. And I listened to a great TED Radio Hour this week, for instance, on Truth and Lies. And highly, highly recommend anything to do with TED. Great resource. So I'm sorry, Ted. I'm sorry, Kyle. Go ahead.
Summarizing David Kahneman right now, who's a psychologist and I think also an economist, an economist. And he was just saying that so he was talking about this person who was listening to this amazing symphony for an hour. But then in the last minute or so, there was just this distortion of sound, this really loud sound. And he's like, oh man, it ruined everything. It ruined the whole experience. And it's actually Daniel Kahneman, not David Kahneman. And then Daniel said, well, it didn't ruin the experience for you. It ruined the memory for you. And so maybe if at the beginning of it there was that really loud sound and it gave you a headache, that might ruin the experience maybe. But if you just, you're having the experience and the experience is really nice, and then at the end you have like sort of a very poor experience, and then you remember that, and so now you have this memory that's ruined. And then he started talking about the colonoscopies, and am I saying that right, Elizabeth? Yeah. And so there's a way to do a colonoscopy that's more pleasant, but then at the end it's much less pleasant. It's like really uncomfortable. And then there's a way to do a colonoscopy apparently where maybe this is during the experiment, but they do it so that it's more pleasant. The whole thing is more pleasant. Actually, the whole thing is less pleasant, but at the end, there's no unpleasantness. Like, there's not as much unpleasantness. So people will choose the memory that is more pleasant. So if something's generally more pleasant, and then at the end it's really unpleasant, people are going to choose the memory that is like just generally more unpleasant, but doesn't have a more unpleasant ending. Does that make sense? Am I making sense? Can you take it from here, Scott, a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, essentially, you could make it more unpleasant, but at the end, the memory is more pleasant. Or it could be the opposite, where it's more of a pleasant experience. It takes longer, but at the end, it's unpleasant. And people want to have the memory, even if the experience was more unpleasant all along, they'd rather have the positive remembrance. And we all get caught up in this trap of we're remembering our experience. And so people live in a relationship and they remember the end of the experience, or somebody passes or dies and we think about what's the good things, what's the bad things, and what's the memory, and instead of what's really there or not there, and what do we do with it. We also, there's a lot of ways where people implant essentially false memories. I remember what happened when I was 1 or 2 years old. Well, you don't actually, because the mind doesn't encode memory at that age. You're not encoding long-term memory at that point. You're only having short-term. And so you can't, but what you do is you remember what somebody remembers about it, or what somebody has told you about it, or what you remember about your memory of that memory of that memory. And so it's this figment of a memory. And it's like this ghost.
That's great, Scott. And so, and now to bring it back to money, so Daniel Kahneman's talking about, well, if you're going to measure happiness, then you got to measure what kind of happiness, the experiencing happiness or the remembering happiness, and then, so the experiencing happiness doesn't seem to increase if you're making over $60,000, $75,000, but there can be a dramatic decrease in experiencing happiness if you're under $60,000. So I don't want to underplay how important money can be if you don't have money, first of all. So there's a lot of people not able to eat enough and to feed their kids, and they're living in low SES circumstances. And it's such a privilege, actually, to be able to talk about money in this way. Oh, well, money doesn't really bring you happiness. That's such a privileged statement, in my opinion. But ultimately, if you're making over $60,000, $75,000, and you're thinking, oh, if I could just make more money, then everything would be satisfied. If I could just have that, better car or better house, and everything would be better, then that's not so much correct. Then you're starting to sort of cross over the line of things don't get much better. You can enjoy yourself if you're a billionaire and you're part of the super rich, and you can, go live in the East Coast of France, and go travel, here one day or here that day. But I mean, Scott, you know all of these clients that you have. You have some rich clients, some well-off clients, and they're not necessarily happier because they're making, $1 million, $1.5 million a year, or $1 billion a year.
Yeah. I mean, I have a number of very privileged, wealthy clients, some of which have had, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And it's absurd. And it didn't make them happier. It made them, the more money they had, the more paranoid, the more difficult life became for them. It's like this energy. And it's like, what am I doing with that? And so it's not necessarily the money that brings you happiness or unhappiness. It's more, what am I creating from that experience? Just like any experience. So I have all this money, and what am I doing with it? If I'm getting trapped by it, I've got to do something with it. And it is creating this greater burden. I've had clients with no money, like on the poverty line. I've at times had no money at times, but lived a more satisfying life. And so, there's certainly, and you could travel the world. And I think, again, it's a really interesting thing thinking about it as a U.S. perspective versus a world perspective. There are many people who, for instance, are in India, who are living at the poverty line, who are very happy because they're not burdened by the stuff. But again, it's easy to say that. They could also then be suffering. Again, it's not the money, yes or no. It's what are we creating from our experiences. And so we have to come back to think of it in a bit more complex way. One of the examples I'll give people real quick to take in a little bit different direction is I have this discussion with parents all the time about funding their kids' college education. And what I've said to parents over and over again is that the kids, our children, have to have skin in the game, so to speak. That if they're not invested in really learning and getting the bigger concept of why they're at school, having the free ride or not doesn't make it better for them. In fact, it often makes it worse because it means that they could disengage from that and just be there to have fun or to extend high school into their later years. Whereas one of the positive things about suffering is that when we recover from that suffering, whatever that suffering is, by recovering from that suffering, it allows us that lesson of how we can take that into other parts of our life. So, by the way, you're listening to Mental Health Matters with Dr. Scott Terry, and today Kyle and Elizabeth and Bella, interns, are here today, and we're talking about finances, money, and how do we make something of this? How do we not get trapped in it? How does it bring us happiness or not bring us happiness? So it's a much bigger question of what are we creating from money. And to finish the idea of college, so we get people sometimes, like myself, with profound learning disabilities. And because we are able to survive that experience of having bad spelling and grammar or whatever it is, and not failing, but learning how to succeed despite the odds, so to speak, it brings us that power and possibility to then, when we go to, let's say, college and it's more challenging, that it's often we're able to succeed. My dissertation, my third dissertation actually, dealt with this notion of people that are both gifted and learning disabled, and the psychological fallout of a dual or asynchronous condition. Is same for AD, people that are ADD and bright, but it's also the same if you're depressed and you're bright, for example. Your performance and your ability are two completely different things. So we'll have a separate show just on this at some point. But the point is that if I'm gifted, let's say, which comes with its own set of burdens, if I'm not able to do something with that giftedness, right? We would all think of giftedness as this great gift. Sorry to say that twice, but it often, though, doesn't give us, if we're not able to utilize that giftedness, it becomes another trap. And and when we're challenged, and let's say we're gifted, but now we get to college or we now get to graduate school and now we're really challenged, it actually creates more of a problem for us because we don't know how to succeed with failure. And we don't know how to come back from failure and that difficulty. So keep going, Kyle. You keep talking.
I'd love to hear from Bella, actually.
So what do you think, Bella, as you're hearing all this?
I mean, if you have money, I think it depends what you do with money, because studies do show that if you give things to other people, then your happiness level rises. So if you donated your money to charity or gave it to someone who's in need,
or volunteering,
or even volunteering, your happiness level would rise if you did something positive with the money that you did get.
Okay.
Yeah, so what you're creating with the money. So if you have a lot of money, and it's about what you're creating with the money.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I grew up without money, and so I value money, but I don't need to hoard it or get trapped by it. Now, other people have had different experiences. So I want to hear, Elizabeth, you haven't talked today.
Hello. So, Scott, do you want to hear my sort of money?
Sure, yeah.
Yes, okay. So, I grew up in a family that I would describe as sort of upper middle class to sort of upper class. As I got older, my parents made more money, and so I grew up. I also went to a private school in New York City where most of my classmates were wealthier than I was, and than my family was, and were much more. Their families were often more ostentatious about money. My family, there was sort of an idea that no matter how much money you had, it was in really bad taste to talk about money, to, flaunt money in any really outward ways. And so I grew up with this feeling, I simultaneously, because my classmates were wealthier than I was, I felt like, oh, well, I don't need money. Like, money is for spoiled people. And basically, I tended to really like characters in books who were poor, virtuous people who, did incredible things in spite of their backgrounds, that kind of thing. And I remember actually when I was growing up thinking that the idea of somebody marrying for money was just the most preposterous thing I could think of. I thought, I won't choose a career because of money. I wouldn't choose a partner because of money. It doesn't mean anything to me. Now, I'm realizing now, later in life, that was a really privileged perspective. So as I'm embarking on a career that, at least initially, is going to involve a pretty low salary. Music teaching does not pay a lot. And heading into the world, I have this very weird, I suddenly have this understanding that a lot of the things that I thought were normal in my childhood were incredibly privileged. And so now I'm trying to...
What are some of those things?
What are some of those things?
Yeah.
Travel was a really... my family traveled a lot. Being able to, eat out, not having to really worry about making food, never having health care be even remotely an issue. Like, that was, you just went to the doctor. It wasn't a problem. And also living in a really nice apartment in New York, which is an extremely expensive city. So those are just some of the things. But I'm, as now I'm a young adult, and I'm starting to understand and the biggest thing that I can't believe I forgot to say is a private education and college. So all of these things were part of my life, and it wasn't that I felt grateful for them. It was just that they just felt they were just part of my life. So now, I'm moving forward, and there's a part of me that's still in the past and thinking like that all of these things that were accessible to me will always be accessible to me. And then part of me is in the present and thinking, how am I going to make my life work with a different level of income, at least for now?
Well, and a different level of meaning. I love this notion of being in school and this notion of perspectivism or relativism that, it's like, okay, I have money, but I'm not rich like really rich people. And it's like, and you're like in the 99th percentile to begin with, it's like, it's crazy. And it's like and all of us become somewhat myopic and trapped in our own heads like that compared to somebody in India or compared to wherever. And the question then becomes, how do we live our lives once we open our eyes? Like, your eyes are now open, and did having money make you happy? Obviously, if you would have lost that money, it would have created great sadness, as Kyle said, that pain at the end. But how do you not make having money core, and what is really important?
It's interesting because I know of a family who the father worked in the steel industry, and that industry tanked, and he couldn't find work after during the recent recession, depression, and they were probably middle class, and they went down to making just about the poverty line, just about $20,000 a year. They were living in an apartment in a low SES area, and I would hang out with them all the time. This person was a bandmate of mine, and we would hang out. They'd have people coming and going into the apartment. We'd have other friends coming over, and I remember they were just for food. They just wouldn't have that much food in the house. They had to be very scarce with food, and it impacted them a lot. They went from making probably $50,000 a year down to close to $40,000, then down to $30,000, then down to $20,000. And it was such an impact on them that the family ended up divorcing. The kids got into drug problems, and sure, all of that could have happened whether or not the father was able to keep his job or not, and there was all this depression. But I mean, how many families, it's the loss of money that can really have such a big impact. But it sounds like, Elizabeth, that your family got much more wealthy over time. You were saying or smaller increases, but your happiness didn't quite increase. You know, you're maybe just as much happy now as you were before, or even less happy or more happy. But it's not as a dramatic of an effect whether you for gaining some money rather than losing money.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I mean, it's hard. It was childhood, so every change that was happening was co-occurring with the normal changes of childhood. So it's really hard to say.
Right.
But I can safely say that I was never. I mean, it wasn't like I was jealous of the other kids who had more money. That was never the case. I thought that I was actually independent of money.
Right.
And so gaining or I don't actually. Also, my parents were very and still are quite private about how much money they make. They it wasn't something we talked about.
Right.
So I don't know whether they lost money in the recession. I don't actually know exactly how that worked. But I will say that there was never a moment in my life that I felt affected by a change in my family's income.
Right. So there was an increase in income, but there was, from what you said earlier, right? There was.
I believe that.
But there wasn't a, there wasn't a significant.
I wasn't aware of a
happiness.
significant change in happiness.
Right.
That's right.
And other things have happened. Other things have happened in different families in your family that contribute. It's not black and white.
Right.
But it's just kind of interesting that sort of a loss in money. People aren't so much focused. So maybe maybe people with money are more focused on losing money, and they're like, oh well, if I lose money, then I can't be happy. It's like if you're sort of richer, living in Manhattan or on the east coast of France or wherever you live, and if you're, let's say you're a billionaire, the thought of going down and living, in maybe Fairfield or living in a place that's not considered maybe just a slightly lower standard of living, that can be a real blow to someone's heart and to someone's ego.
Absolutely. And Kyle, in our last minute here, it's certainly an interesting thing to keep playing with, this notion of, as somebody's listening to this, let's say, what have you been doing with your money in terms of hoarding it, or in terms of overspending, or in terms of trying to get happiness by spending money? Come back to looking at, how am I getting that I'm the one who chooses what I'm experiencing, what I'm creating from my experience. So what is your final thoughts, everybody? Just 2 words here.
Money can bring you satisfaction, but it doesn't mean you get happiness.
Okay. Elizabeth, what's your final thought?
Money is very important up to a certain level of income, and beyond that level, it becomes much less significant.
Excellent. And Kyle, final thought?
Money's really important if you don't have it, but if you have money, then it's not so important.
All right. Or it's important if I make it important in my head and what I do to live my life. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll talk, everybody, on another show about couples counseling and money. So look forward to talking that. Bye, everyone. Bye.
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 Bye.